You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. It's been a rough couple of weeks. We had COVID and...
I know, for the second time. I was hoping we were one and done.
Yeah, I thought those days were gone, but not so much fun. I'm sure some of our listeners have been dealing with the same thing. So it brings up the subject of today's podcast, and it's how can people be tested for mold exposure?
Absolutely. And I guess this is a big, among the Facebook groups that you're in related to mold, this is one of the biggest topics, isn't it?
It is. Yep. And a lot of times people are asking like, well, how do you get tested? Can my GP, order the blood work or whatever? And then the next question always is, are you taking whatever that they take to detox?
Yeah. And I guess people jump to wanting the cure without thoroughly going through the symptoms and figuring out how they can verify what it actually is.
Exactly. That's a good point to bring up. For our listeners, even if you go get tested, you do a medical mycotoxin test and you find out that you have high levels of whatever, and then you just go through the detox process. If you don't address your home or wherever you're being exposed, you're doing it in vain.
Absolutely. So, I guess the first place that I would start with is, what is mold exposure? Do you want to define it from your perspective? Like, what would you consider? I know it seems really simple, but lots of people hear mold and then they either say, well, it's everywhere, doesn't matter, right? So everybody's exposed. Or they say, oh my goodness, I just saw some black thing on my wall. Like, how would you define mold exposure?
So what we're really going to talk about is mold toxicity.
Okay.
And how to be tested for that. So this is completely the medical side of it. Obviously, we're going to talk about the environmental side, which interestingly enough, I had to delay my podcast interview with Dr. Diane because of COVID, but I will be interviewing her pretty soon, so it should be out here in a couple weeks. But when I say mold exposure, we're talking about mold toxicity. So for our listeners, when you get exposed to mold, depending on your body, everybody's going to react differently. Mm-hmm. Something I see in the Facebook groups all the time is men aren't affected like women are. I don't know if I believe that. I'm obviously not a medical professional, but I think men are just so stubborn. We don't think that black spot you just talked about on your wall is making anybody sick.
Well, but I have not looked at any of the research, but I'd
fair to guess that women are exposed differently than men?
Meaning,
I think that, if we just go from a reproductive standpoint, it takes a woman 90 days to produce a new egg, right? So for 90 days, it's incubating in her body.
Mm-hmm.
And so the quality of that egg is based on 90 days. Men produce millions of sperm in every day. So so you could stop exposing yourself as a man to something, and in 72 days, you have all new sperm if you've stopped exposure. But a woman, that egg is still incubating for 90 days. So I think with women, when women say that, I think it's because women's bodies are built to carry babies and to incubate things for 9 months, for 40 weeks. And so the woman's body will take in and hold, and this is my guess, I don't have research to back it up. A woman's body will take in and hold whatever that body is exposed to for far longer because it was built to gestate something for 40 weeks.
Right. And that's where the mold exposure episode that we're talking about comes into play. So what you're saying is for a man, their body's going to detox those mycotoxins much faster.
Just like men metabolize alcohol faster out of their bodies, which is why most women are lightweights with alcohol, which is why men detox things. I think Dr. Fox talked about it in the first interview you did with her. She actually said something about if she has a patient who wants to get pregnant, she actually recommends that for 3 months, they work on mold detox, like detoxing from a lot of things before they try because of that fact.
Yes, which makes perfect sense, which brings us into one of the first questions our listeners would have. What are the symptoms of mold exposure?
Yeah, and what always shocks me is they're so similar to everything else.
Exactly, and that's what makes it very complex. Our listeners know you have to deal with the medical side of it, you have to deal with the home side of it, you have to get IEPs involved, you got to get medical professionals involved. So that brings up my first, and I'll go through all the symptoms, but you should consult with a doctor first. It's very important though, and I'm not saying there aren't GPs out there that are capable of it, but most GPs are not going to be that familiar with mold. Mm-hmm. So you've got to find someone like a Dr. Fox, Dr. Diane, someone like Heather that's a health coach. There's certain professionals that you should get involved. And so if you're our listener, you're like, well, how much does all that cost? That's where it starts getting very complex.
Well, I've heard you mention in a lot of podcast episodes and even in your books that people should be looking for a mold literate doctor.
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly?
Somebody that's familiar with the symptoms of mold exposure, someone that knows how to test for it.
Okay.
Someone that knows how to walk you through the detoxing process.
Ah, okay. So when you're trying to find a doctor who is mold literate, they've got to be able to do those things that you just mentioned.
Right.
Okay.
And, for some people, maybe they only have to get me involved and then their mold literate doctor. But that's not, for the most part, how that goes. You've got to have the IEP, you have to have the mold inspector, you have to have testing done. If there's mold in the home, we have to do remediation. There's a lot of people you have to get involved. And I think for CNC Contractor Services, that's why for me, and we're not going to go down this rabbit hole, I don't see why it's a big deal if you hire an IEP that's familiar with the mold inspection side, the mold testing side, the mold remediation side, which is what I do.
Absolutely. So to your point, you're not just dealing with a mold issue or dealing with mold toxicity. It's not I just go to one person. You actually have to build a support team of people, both medical and environmental.
Exactly.
To work on, it's not just one person.
Exactly. And it's, I have a client in Colorado. She's a realtor. That's a perfect example. Like your realtor is somebody that's going to walk you through the entire process, but they're going to tell you, you should hire a home inspector. You should have the home tested for radon. You should get a mold inspector. You should do this type of mold testing. They help you with the appraisal side of it. They help you with the contracts. It's a complex process, just like purchasing a home. And your realtor, I'm not saying they can't, but you shouldn't let the realtor just do everything. You have to be involved too as the home buyer. So same concept when it comes to mold. You need to get all the proper professionals involved. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I understand, like, I've yet to find the proper money tree seeds. I don't know if you found any, but the money part comes into play. Mm-hmm. And in our current medical system in the United States, we seem to have, I'm not sure how I want to word this, but it's a stigma that's associated with different illnesses and diseases. Mm-hmm. And so I don't feel like unless you go out and get the proper mold literate doctor, you're probably not going to get the help you need.
Absolutely.
Which brings up, like, our listeners are probably like, well, tell us, Steve, what are the symptoms? You already said it. There's so many of them, and they're commonly associated with just like COVID.
Yeah, like brain fog.
Yeah. Brain fog, fatigue, cough, fever, stuffy nose. A lot of people exposed to mold get skin rashes and eczema. Eczema. But there are so many things like anxiety, depression. And when it's just a non-educated medical professional that doesn't understand mold, if they're only going to treat you for anxiety, then that's not really going to help. And it brings me back to what you said earlier. I think sometimes as humans, we just want the pill that's going to fix it.
Absolutely.
And just like in the mold world, there's not a single test that's the silver bullet. There's not a silver bullet pill you take to detox. There's a lot of factors that play into it.
Absolutely. And this brings me back to this whole idea, and I know you've talked about this in your books, but you've also talked about it on this podcast. That's one of the reasons why it's so important to journal.
Yes.
Because the symptoms of mold toxicity and mold exposure are so similar to other things, it's really critical to keep a journal of what's changing. Like, you bought me an Oura ring for my birthday, and I just love it. I love it because I knew exactly when I got sick with COVID based on the data from the Oura ring, and I knew exactly when I was on the uphill recovering from it.
Right.
And so I think mold is the same in terms of you should be documenting what rooms do you notice that you've been in and spent a lot of time in, how much time, and what are the symptoms, and when did the symptoms start, and when do they abate? Don't you think, like, journaling is a key piece of this?
Yes, and Dr. Diane, in the podcast interview we did last year, she talked about that. She's like, I have my patients write down all of their symptoms, and they write those down, whether it's once a month, once a week, once a day. She said, a lot of times my patients come back to me and they're like, I don't feel like I'm getting any better. Well, that's why she has you do that, so that she can say, well, do you still have that cough? Do you still have a stuffy nose? Are you still fatigued? And it is very helpful because that's how important it is to document. But going back to your Oura ring, obviously Oura is not sponsoring our podcast.
They should.
If we have any of their representatives, feel free to reach out. But just tell our listeners, because you're very data driven. You've told me, you're like, you should go get an Oura ring, and I just laugh and I'm like, no. But just explain what that Oura ring tracks.
So the Oura ring tracks a bunch of data. If you're a woman, it will help track your cycle, which I think any woman who's still a cycling human being should be tracking because it'll give you a lot of good information. But it also gives you things like your sleep. How much REM sleep did you get? How much deep sleep did you get? How many times did you wake up in the middle of the night? It will track when you fall asleep, when you wake up. But the piece that's so related, I think, to mold toxicity or COVID or anything else is it tracks your heart rate variability, your HRV. Mm-hmm. And when it starts to notice that your heart rate variability is like messed up, it knows that illness is coming. So it looks at the sleep quality going down. It looks at the heart rate variability getting crazy, and it will signal to you, it feels like disease is coming, so like relax.
Yeah.
And that's the important piece, because if you're using an Oura ring and you're starting to notice mold exposure, I wouldn't be surprised if the Oura ring doesn't hint to you and tell you your HRV is going out of whack, your sleep is getting weird, like something in your body, your immune system is fighting harder than it normally does. Mm-hmm. That's a good data point for you to bring to a mold literate doctor.
Yeah, and when you were explaining all those things, I'm always looking at like, okay, how can we tie this into mold exposure? For our listeners, let's say, you're going to go on vacation and you have all this data from your Oura ring or the journal that you're keeping. You've written all these symptoms down. You leave and go on vacation for a week. When you come back, you can track that. And it's easy to say, well, I left for the weekend and I felt much better. Well, did you feel better just because you were doing things you're normally not doing? Like, there's a lot of psychological aspects of it. But on the other hand, if our listeners are journaling everything, they can see, like, oh, so for a week, I didn't really have chronic fatigue. Well, but was it because we were going to Disney World every day? So that's why it's important. And you've said this the whole time we've been doing this podcast. Journaling is very important.
Very, very important. And I also think it goes back to this whole idea of making sure you build a mold literate support team around you.
Mm-hmm.
So if you hire an IEP and they never ask you about what you're doing on the health side of things, like who are you partnering with for your health side, that should be a red flag.
Right.
Because your IEP's got to work with whatever data or whatever findings that doctor, that mold literate, and if they're not even asking you like what's going on the health side, you might want to question.
Yeah, and in defense of our listeners, I get it. If you know you have mold concerns in your home, you're going to attack the first thing that comes to mind. And so when it comes to the medical side, I'm sure our listeners are like, okay, Steve, get to what the topic is. But as far as what you know just from these podcasts and what you hear me say, how do people get tested for mold toxicity?
Well, I mean, they've got to do like the mycotoxin medical testing, right?
Exactly.
Don't you talk about that in the mycotoxin prevention kit?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
And so for our listeners, this is why you work with a mold literate physician or professional. I mean, it could be whoever. But you can do either blood testing, which is through my mycolab, or you can do urine testing. Those are the two that I'm more familiar with. When I talk to Dr. Diane and Dr. Fox, like the interview I'm doing with Dr. Diane, we're going to talk about it. She's going to explain why she does the type of testing that she does. And I guess my point is some physicians believe that the blood work is more important. Some believe that the urine testing is. So for our listeners, you can either do the blood or you can do the urine. The most common thing I hear is, well, if it's a urine test, is that showing that we're getting rid of the mycotoxins?
Okay.
Well, yes. And if that's what it's telling you, that's telling you you're being exposed.
Correct.
And that's why the IEP is so important, because where is that exposure? A lot of people work from home.
Yeah.
So is it at home? Maybe you go to a gym every day and you're being exposed every day.
Exactly.
That's why the home side of it is so important. And, if you're just going to say, well, my mom has a bunch of mold at her house, that's what it is. I understand that, but don't just assume it's not from your own home.
Absolutely. And I also think it's important when you're working with a mold literate doctor, when they say to you, I want to do blood testing or I want to do urine testing, I'm a big fan of asking the doctor why.
Exactly.
Like, let the doctor explain to you why they prefer blood over urine or urine over blood, because if they can't give you the rationale, then you should do your homework on both to make an informed decision. But usually doctors know why they prefer blood or urine testing.
Yeah. And it's funny because I was just talking, like I said, to a realtor in Colorado. And I said to her, I said, I'm all about hearing why other professionals don't believe in using ozone treatment or why they don't believe in certain chemicals. I'm not so thick-headed that I'm like, nope, it has to be this. If you can explain it and it makes sense, then I can understand and you could change my perception or my opinion about it.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, you have to be able to understand why you would do the urine test over the blood work.
Correct.
And you said it perfectly. If their physician or health professional doesn't know why and can't explain it, then maybe they don't know. They're just not educated enough.
Or maybe they're just going with something because a pharmaceutical rep sold them on using that test. So, I mean, you just have to understand, like, I love healthcare professionals, but I have to be on board with the approach they want to take with my body.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess for our listeners is, there are certain labs, and I'm not going to name those labs. I'll go through the list of labs, but there's certain labs I just don't like for certain reasons. It might be there's a lot of false positives. Maybe I just don't think that they're really the best way you can test medically. But for our listeners, so the blood one is my mycolab. I would assume there's other labs that do the blood test. But for urine, there is LabCorp, there's Sunrise Lab, there's Mosaic, which used to be called Great Plains. And then, obviously, the lab I prefer for this reason, and I'll be clear with our listeners, I like real-time lab. They do a urine test, but real-time lab is the same lab that we use on the environmental side for the EMA test. And the reason that I prefer real-time lab is they can do both. And when they created the EMA test and how they do that, a lot of it was based off the medical side. So, and this is just my opinion, I don't have facts to back it up. I'm sure there's white papers out there, but they could see the medical side and see what, the most common mycotoxins there were in someone's body. And then they incorporate that into the EMA test. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And I'll just point out from a financial perspective, it is important with any lab where you're going to have blood drawn or any professional who's mold literate that's going to do testing for you, ask them what the price is up front.
Yeah.
I know I've been surprised by what I've been charged with lab work. Like shocked and surprised. And I think transparency and cost and comparing costs between one professional who's going to charge you, let's say $1,500 for mold testing, like you should know if somebody wants to charge you $10,000 to do a bunch of testing, that should be transparent up front. So you're making an informed financial decision. Right.
And you bring up a great point. For our listeners, it's important to understand if that medical professional is recommending, let's say real-time labs, does their fees include their analysis of the results?
I agree.
Because if it doesn't, it's like, this is why I prefer the EMA testing on the environmental side. Our testing kits on the website include my analysis. If I was just selling those kits on the website and then our clients come back to me and they're like, so Steve, what does this all mean? If I turn around and said, well, you got to book a consultation, they were maybe misled a little bit. So full transparency for our listeners, make sure you understand what those fees include.
Well, and I think you bring up another good point. I think so often people go, well, why would I go on CNC Contractor Services website and pay for an EMA test when I can just go do it on my own? Well, you don't get the interpretation from
Exactly.
Steve. You don't get the full, it's one thing to look at numbers. It's quite another to understand what they actually mean and what your next step should be. So when they purchase an EMA test, for example, through you, they're also getting your interpretations, which is a big deal.
Yep. And to be clear, too, though, with our listeners, that does not include a consultation.
Correct. Consultation is separate, but at least interpretation results.
And we have packages that include all of that. But that's an important part for our listeners. Like, does this $1,500, does it include a follow-up consultation with my doctor?
Correct. That's an important question to ask. Now, a lot of people will get into all of this testing and then sometimes even before they get the results, they will run to detox because everybody thinks a detox, solves everything, which I love to remind people that our bodies naturally detox all the time.
Right.
So jumping into some, 24-hour fast, 48-hour, our bodies, that's how we stay healthy. Our body detoxes. But what is your take on people? Because I see a lot of things about detoxing from mold. What's your take on that?
Just like the disclaimer we have for every podcast episode, obviously I'm not a medical professional, but from what I understand and what I've been told by people like Dr. Diane, Dr. Fox, the type of mycotoxins you have in your body would determine the whatever supplements or medications. There's prescribed medications that you can take. That's what would determine that. That's why it's important to work with a medical professional, because you brought up something, we're not going to go too deep into this, but 20 to 25% of the population has that HLA-DR gene. That prevents them from detoxing mycotoxins like most people. If you have Lyme's or CIRS, which is CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, if you have Hashimoto's, if you are a diabetic, your medical professional's going to or should understand how the detox process should go for you personally. There's not a one size fits all.
No, and I also think working with a medical professional, one, to determine what kind of detox you should do is important, but also to prepare you for how long you're going to be tired or have brain fog, or maybe you need to take a few days off of work. I'm not sure how mold detox works, but detoxes in general will knock you out for a bit.
Yeah, that's the most common thing I hear is, for 10 days, it was like having COVID or something like that. So that's why it's important for our listeners to understand you've got to get the medical professional involved, because I'm going to tell you what I'm telling you right now. That's not my specialty and it's way out of my wheelhouse. So at the end of the day, I'm going to help our listeners identify and find the mold, get it remediated properly. And then at that point, that's why they work with the Dr. Diane's or Dr. Fox.
Absolutely. So what's your call to action for people?
If you think that you're sick because of mold, hire a medical professional and get tested. That's the first thing. On the medical side, that's what I would say. Now, I'm sure the medical professionals that are listening are like, no, you should call us first and we'll book a consultation. But that's my take on it, is get tested.
And while you're doing the testing, get educated. That's why you have the mycotoxin prevention kit. That's why you have Mold 101. You have a bunch of digital bundles. You have courses on Udemy. But get educated while you're working through this whole testing process.
Exactly. And it will, for our listeners, it'll save you a lot of time and a lot of money.
Yep.
Not that my way is the only way, but knowing the proper steps to take is very important. Because if you go out and you just hurry and hire a remediator that doesn't understand the medical side of mold and you spend $30,000, $40,000 and then you still are having issues, you might have to get someone like myself involved. And not that I'm trying to sell myself, but that's why it's important to get an IEP involved. And one that's, competent enough to understand both the home side and the medical side.
Absolutely.
So, like you said, we have bundles. They can go right to our website. I'll put a link, and I'm sure it's for both bundles, but I'll put a link in the description. But that was a great conversation. I think the medical side is I think the home side's complex, but the medical side is very complex, as we all know. So we appreciate all you listeners. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.